back door splintered. Dorothy McAllister, 78, froze in her Tennessee farmhouse, the icy dread a physical blow. Two menacing shadows loomed outside. Her old deaf Australian shepherd, Bud, whom her son Harold and daughter-in-law Carol had called useless and wanted put down, now stood between her and the terror. His frail body tensed, a silent shield against the looming horror. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. Harold's farm wasn't huge, but it had always hummed with purpose. That morning, though, a different kind of quiet hung in the air, heavy and thick. Dorothy McAllister sat on the porch swing, her hands clasped, watching her son, Harold Henderson, and his wife, Carol Henderson, talking low by the barn. Her heart felt like a stone in her chest. Bud, the old Australian shepherd mix, lay a few feet away. His once vibrant red merle coat, now faded, his muzzle dusted white. He was a shadow of his former self, bumping into the porch post when he turned, completely unaware of the murmur of voices. He was profoundly deaf now, a silent world surrounding him. Harold walked over, his face creased with what he believed was concern. But to Dorothy, it felt like judgment. "Mama," he started, his voice a little too gentle. "We talked to the vet again. He said Bud's joints are getting worse, and with his deafness, he's just suffering, Mama. He can't hear a thing, bumps into everything. He's confused." Harold hated seeing the once vigorous Bud stumble, calling it undignified. He remembered Bud as the most tireless, intuitive herder he'd ever known, a blur of motion and focus, always anticipating the cattle's movements. Now, Bud moved slowly, his intelligent eyes still sharp, but lacking the swiftness that made him useful on a farm. Carol joined them, her arm linked through Harold's, offering what she thought was practical advice. "He's just an expense now, Dorothy, and completely useless on a farm. He can't even warn you about a rabbit, let alone anything serious." She talked about the vet bills for his old joints and his special diet, ticking off reasons why it just made sense. They both truly believed they were being humane, seeing his age and disability as a burden, a kindness misplaced to keep him alive. Dorothy looked at Bud. His head was up now, his eyes fixed on her, seeking connection in a world without sound. She saw the gentle soul still there, the spark of affection that had been with her since she'd seen him as a pup, helped Harold train him. He was a part of her, like a grandchild. She remembered the long days, watching him work, his absolute devotion, to hear them talk about him as if he were a broken tool, an object to be discarded, made a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "He's not suffering, Harold," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "He still loves a good scratch behind the ears. He still wags his tail when I come close." Harold sighed, running a hand over his face. "Mama, it's not the same. He's not the dog he used to be. It's just kinder to let him go peacefully." Dorothy didn't respond right away. She reached out, her hand gently stroking Bud's head. His tail gave a slow, tentative thump against the porch floor. She felt the warmth of his fur, the steady beat of his old heart. Her heart ached at the thought of him being put down when he was still full of affection, still responsive to her touch, still very much Bud. She saw his deafness not as a burden, but as a vulnerability that made her love him more fiercely. It wasn't about usefulness. It was about loyalty, about love, about a promise made without words. "No," Dorothy said, her voice firm, resolute. Harold and Carol looked at her, surprised. She rarely stood against them like this. "Bud is coming home with me." A moment of stunned silence hung in the air. Harold started to protest, but Dorothy simply stood up, her gaze unwavering. "He's coming home." The drive back to her small, weather-beaten farmhouse, nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural Tennessee, was quiet. Bud lay curled in the back seat, his head resting against Dorothy's thigh. His breathing was soft, deep. The vibrations from the old Ford pickup's engine hummed through her leg, a gentle lullaby. She kept one hand on his warm fur, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall of his body. He was exhausted, worn out by the day's stress, by the unfamiliar voices, by the quiet conversation he couldn't hear but had surely sensed. She felt his trust, his complete surrender. The road unwound before them, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She stroked his head, feeling the soft fur between her fingers. "We're going home, boy," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear, but hoping he felt the promise in her touch. "Just you and me." The old Ford pickup bumped along the gravel road, kicking up dust until it finally pulled to a stop beside Dorothy's small, weather-beaten farmhouse. Bud, a little stiff, jumped down. He sniffed the familiar ground around the porch, his tail giving a soft, inquisitive wag. This was home, in a different way now. He navigated by nose and sight, his head low, taking in the scent of damp earth, honeysuckle, and the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke clinging to the old house. Dorothy watched him, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Here, he wouldn't be judged by what he couldn't do, but cherished for who he was. Life at Dorothy's began to settle into a gentle rhythm, shaped by Bud's silent world. He slept longer now, stretched out on a worn rug by the back door, often stirring with a soft sigh. When Dorothy moved around the house, he wouldn't hear her, but he'd feel the faint vibrations of her footsteps through the old wooden floors. That subtle tremble was his cue. His head would lift slowly, his intelligent eyes finding her across the room, a silent question in their depths. Every morning, as Dorothy sat on her porch swing, sipping coffee, Bud would nudge her hand for a head scratch. He'd push his warm, white-muzzled face into her palm, sighing contentedly as her fingers worked through his thinning fur. She'd talk to him then, a soft, steady stream of words about the rising sun, the morning birdsong he couldn't hear, the plans for her small vegetable patch. She knew he couldn't understand the syllables, but she believed he understood her heart. When she went to check her tomatoes or tend to her herbs, Bud would painstakingly follow, his old body moving slower, but his eyes fixed on her. She'd learned to give him gentle hand signals. A soft pat on her thigh meant, "Come here." A pointing finger to his bed meant, "Go lie down." He learned them quickly, a testament to the sharp mind still tucked inside his aging body. He wouldn't hear her call, but he never missed her gaze. Their days were filled with comfortable, unhurried companionship. Bud spent hours basking in sunbeams that crept across the porch, his old bones soaking up the warmth. He'd track squirrels with his eyes, his tail giving a slow, almost imperceptible twitch, the ancient hunting instinct still flickering within him, even if he couldn't chase them anymore. At night, he'd settle by her feet in front of the wood stove, a quiet, warm presence. The gentle crackle of burning logs, a sound he couldn't hear, filled the cozy room, a soundtrack to their shared peace. Sometimes he'd stretch out a paw and rest it on her foot, a silent gesture of his devotion. Dorothy would stroke his head, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. They had developed a silent symphony of mutual devotion. He was her constant shadow, a warm weight in her life, a reminder that some bonds transcended words, transcended even sound. He may have been deaf, old, and no longer useful in the way Harold and Carol understood it, but to Dorothy, he was everything. He was a veteran of years, deserving of every quiet moment, every gentle touch, every peaceful sigh in front of her wood stove. He was home. Dorothy's farmhouse wasn't just a house. It was a quiet haven now, a sanctuary where time seemed to slow, wrapping around her and Bud in a comforting embrace. The world outside, with its hurried judgments and practical demands, faded the moment the old Ford's tires crunched to a stop on the gravel driveway. Inside, it was just the two of them, forging a bond built not on words, but on presence, on touch, on understanding deeper than sound. Every morning, the first rays of Tennessee sunshine would slant through the kitchen window, painting stripes across the worn linoleum. Dorothy would be at the stove, making coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. Bud, still curled on his rug by the back door, wouldn't hear the gentle clatter of her mug or the soft hiss of the percolator. But he'd feel it, a subtle vibration through the old floorboards, a slight change in the air pressure as she moved. His head would lift slowly, his intelligent eyes finding her across the room. A silent acknowledgement, a question in their depths. She'd tap her thigh twice, a soft, inviting rhythm. Bud would rise, his old body stiff, but his tail giving a gentle, appreciative thump against the floor. He'd pad over, settling himself by her feet as she carried her coffee to the porch swing. This was their ritual. As Dorothy sipped her coffee, watching the dew glisten on the tall grass, Bud would nudge her hand with his wet nose, asking for his morning head scratch. She'd lean down, her fingers working through the thinning fur behind his ears, down his neck, feeling the warmth of him, the steady beat of his old heart. "Morning, sweet boy," she'd murmur, even though she knew he couldn't hear a word. "Another beautiful day, isn't it? Sun's up, birds are singing. Wish you could hear them." She'd describe the world to him, her voice soft and low, a steady stream of narrative. She talked about the way the light fell on the distant tree line, the rabbit that had darted across the yard, the plans she had for her small vegetable patch. She believed he understood the cadence of her voice, the tenderness in her tone, the language of her heart, if not her exact words. His eyes, though old, would stay fixed on her face, seeming to absorb every nuance of her expression. Later, when she went out to tend her tomatoes or clip her herbs, Bud would follow. He moved slower now, a deliberate, patient gait, but his eyes never left her. He'd lie down near her, usually in a patch of sunshine, his presence a comforting weight. If she wandered too far, a gentle tap on her back or a soft brush of her hand along his flank would redirect him. He'd learned her silent cues, her subtle nudges, responding with an earnestness that melted her heart. She wasn't leading him so much as they were moving together, two halves of a quiet, shared world. In the evenings, after she'd eaten her supper and the cool night air began to creep in, they'd settle by the wood stove. The fire crackled, a sound Bud never knew, but the radiating warmth was a comfort they both shared. He'd rest his head on her feet, or sometimes stretch out fully, his back pressed against her leg as she read from an old paperback. Her hand would often stray from the book, resting on his flank, feeling the slow, deep rhythm of his breath. It was a silent connection, earned over weeks and months of patient understanding. He was an old dog, deaf and slow, but he was hers, and in that quiet farmhouse, surrounded by thick woods and fields, far from any close neighbors, his presence was not a burden, but a profound, irreplaceable comfort. He was a constant warm weight in her life, a reminder that some bonds transcended words, transcended even sound. He was home. The old farmhouse breathed a quiet peace that night, a deep, contented sigh settling over the Tennessee hills. Dorothy McAllister was fast asleep in her warm bed, the kind of sleep that only comes after a full day of quiet contentment, of shared silent moments with her old dog, Bud. The wood stove, still glowing faintly, cast flickering shadows across the living room, a soft pulse against the deepening cold outside. Bud lay curled in his usual spot by the back kitchen door, his old body a warm weight on the worn rug, rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of his breath. The night was cold, moonless, and utterly still. Outside, beyond the thin protection of the old walls, two shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the woods. They moved without haste, but with a deliberate, unsettling purpose. Boots, worn and scuffed, crunched softly on the frozen leaves and brittle twigs that carpeted the forest floor. These weren't hunters or lost hikers. These were young men, desperate and reckless, their faces hardened by choices that had led them to this isolated spot. They knew an old woman lived alone here, miles from the nearest paved road, tucked away from watchful eyes. They saw her as an easy mark, a quick score, a target that wouldn't put up a fight. One of them, a lean figure with quick, darting eyes, pointed towards the dim outline of Dorothy's back door. It was the oldest, most weathered part of the house, likely the least secure. They slipped through the last line of trees, crossing the open yard with a predator's silent grace, their intent as sharp and cold as the winter air. Inside, Bud's deep sleep began to fray. He didn't hear the crunch of boots on leaves, the soft thud of a body stepping onto the porch. His world was soundless, but his old body, honed by years of instinct, felt something. A low, persistent vibration, faint at first, then growing stronger, traveled through the cold ground, up the wooden porch, and into the worn rug beneath him. It was a disturbance, a shift in the otherwise profound stillness that always enveloped the farmhouse. His ears, useless for sound, twitched with phantom expectation. His intelligent eyes, though veiled by the darkness, remained closed, but a subtle tremor ran through his old muscles. He stirred, a low, almost imperceptible rumble rising in his chest. His nose, still keen, caught a scent that didn't belong, a sharp, metallic tang, mixed with stale sweat and something else, something primal and unsettling, carried on the faintest wisp of air that crept in beneath the poorly sealed door. His head lifted slowly, his eyes now wide open, piercing the gloom. He was deaf, yes, but every other sense was screaming. There was something wrong. There was danger. Upstairs, Dorothy shifted in her sleep, pulling the quilt tighter around her. A gust of wind rattled a loose pane in her bedroom window, a sound that she dismissed even in her slumber. She felt safe, secure. Her small, quiet world was exactly that, quiet and entirely her own. She was utterly unaware of the menacing shadows gathering just below her, by the kitchen door, their hands already reaching. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. The porch groaned under the weight of the men as they pressed themselves against the back door. One of them produced a crowbar, a glint of steel barely visible in the dark. He wedged it into the space between the doorframe and the old, weather-beaten wood of the door itself. A quiet grunt, then the distinct, sickening creak of straining timber. The vibrations intensified, running like a jolt through the old floorboards. Bud, no longer merely stirring, was on his feet now, his old joints protesting, but his body coiled. He was a silent sentinel, his eyes locked on the crack beneath the door, where the cold outside air was now seeping in with an uninvited, sinister chill. He didn't know what was out there, but every fiber of his being, every ancient instinct of protection, told him it was something bad. Very bad. The faint light from the stove cast long, dancing shadows, but Bud was focused, his gaze unwavering, a silent guardian in the growing dread. The wood gave another, louder groan, closer to a snap. The crowbar bit into the old wood of Dorothy's back door with a sickening, splintering groan. Dorothy McAllister upstairs stirred uneasily in her bed, a vague sense of unease creeping into her dream. But downstairs on his worn rug, Bud didn't just stir. He rose, his old body a coil of silent tension. The vibrations from the door, a sudden, violent shudder through the floorboards, jolted through him like an electric shock. He couldn't hear the tearing wood, the muttered curses outside, but he felt them, deeply, primally. A cold, malevolent breath of air snaked under the protesting door, carrying the scent of fear and something sharper, something dangerous. Bud's eyes, usually soft and gentle, hardened, gleaming in the faint light from the wood stove. A low, guttural growl, a sound Dorothy had rarely heard, a sound that spoke of ancient, untamed instinct rather than simple annoyance, rumbled in his chest. It was a sound born not of hearing, but of absolute conviction. The first intruder, a broad-shouldered man, leveraged the crowbar again. The wood gave way with a louder crack, a splintered gap appearing. A hand, gloved and dark, snaked through the opening, reaching for the latch. Bud didn't bark. He didn't make a sound Dorothy could hear. He exploded. He threw his old, heavy body against the door, not away from it, but into it, snarling with a ferocity that defied his years. He was a blur of faded red merle fur and raw, unexpected power. His silent charge slammed into the door, making it shudder, momentarily startling the intruder. Bud pressed himself squarely against the breach, a furry, living barricade. His head dipped, his powerful jaws snapping and lunging at the gap, a terrifying, silent whirlwind of teeth and instinct. He wasn't just guarding, he was attacking. The intruder on the other side pulled his hand back with a yelp of surprise, then shouted, a sound Bud couldn't hear, but whose violence he sensed. The dog was relentless. As the door splintered further, creating a wider gap, Bud lunged through, his aim true. He latched onto the thick fabric of the intruder's pant leg, then tightened his jaws, digging in, holding on with the tenacity of his herding days. He shook his head, a primal gesture, trying to bring down the larger form. The intruder roared, less from pain than from shocked disbelief. "Get him off!" the man yelled, stumbling backward, losing his footing on the frozen ground. The second intruder, who had been holding a flashlight, startled and enraged by the sudden, silent fury of the old dog, reacted instinctively. He swung his heavy boot, catching Bud hard in the flank. The impact sent a jolt of pain through Bud's aging body, knocking him sprawling against the wall of the house. A sharp, pained yelp escaped his throat, a sound that even in his deafness was a profound shock to his own system. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, the wind knocked out of him, one leg held at an awkward angle. But Bud didn't stay down. Despite the throbbing pain, despite the way his old joints screamed in protest, he scrambled back up, limping badly, his eyes still burning with an unyielding purpose. He was bleeding now, a trickle from his mouth where he'd bitten down hard, and a fresh gash forming over his eye from a glancing blow. But he didn't give an inch. His deaf ears heard nothing of the shouts and curses, but his ancient instincts, his unwavering loyalty to the gentle woman inside, screamed. Protect. He launched himself again, not at the same man, but at the second intruder, biting at his arm, a furious, silent blur against the dark. The intruders had not counted on such a defender, such an impossible, silent hero. The old dog, bleeding and limping, launched himself again, a silent blur of fury. His teeth found purchase on the second intruder's arm, not a deep, tearing bite, but a painful clamp that elicited a guttural shout. Bud held on, shaking his head, his whole body trembling with the effort and the pain, but refusing to let go. His world was soundless, but the intent of the men, the terror of the moment, resonated through him with deafening clarity. He tasted blood, his own and the intruder's, a coppery tang that spurred him on. The two men, already rattled by the unexpected ferocity of the seemingly decrepit dog, exchanged desperate glances. They hadn't come for a fight, not with something so utterly relentless and fearless. This wasn't just an old deaf farm dog. This was a force of nature, a primal protector. The first intruder, his leg throbbing, kicked out again, catching Bud's already injured flank. This time, Bud let out another soft whine, a sound of deep pain, but he didn't release his grip on the second man's arm until a sharp, tearing pull finally forced him back. He stumbled, falling hard onto the frozen porch boards, a dark patch quickly blooming on his faded fur. "Forget it. This ain't worth it," one of them hissed, his voice hoarse with adrenaline and frustration. The other, clutching his arm, nodded frantically. The old dog, slumped on the ground, still watched them, his eyes unblinking, burning with an unwavering vigilance, a silent promise of more if they dared to try again. The thought of this dog, injured and exhausted, yet still ready to fight, was more terrifying than any weapon. Cursing under their breath, stumbling and disoriented, their carefully planned quick score shattered. They melted back into the inky blackness of the woods, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. Their retreat was hurried, clumsy, a stark contrast to their earlier stealth. Upstairs, Dorothy McAllister was finally fully awake. The violent thumps and crashes against her back door, the muffled shouts she vaguely registered, had pierced through her deep sleep. A cold, stark terror seized her, clutching at her throat. She fumbled for her old flashlight on the bedside table, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. What was happening? She had heard stories, whispered warnings about isolated farmhouses, about desperate men. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. She stumbled out of bed, pulling on her thick robe, her legs unsteady. The sounds had stopped now, leaving an unsettling, profound silence, broken only by the frantic beat of her own heart. She crept to the top of the stairs, the flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of her, illuminating dust motes in the cold air. The air in the house was sharper, colder, tainted with a strange metallic smell she couldn't place. Then she saw it. The back door, usually a solid, comforting barrier, now stood shattered, splintered, hanging precariously on one hinge. A gaping hole in the familiar safety of her home. And there, slumped against the shattered doorframe, lay Bud. Her breath hitched. For a terrifying second, her mind flashed to the worst, a cold dread washing over her. But then, as her shaky flashlight beam found him fully, she saw him. He was panting, his sides heaving, a sticky wetness matting the fur around his muzzle. There was a fresh, angry gash above his eye, and one leg was held at an awkward angle, clearly injured. He looked utterly exhausted, broken. But he was alive. And as her gaze fell upon him, as his intelligent eyes, though weary, met hers, his tail gave a weak, slow thump against the worn rug. Not a joyful wag, but a silent acknowledgement, a soft declaration of loyalty, even in his pain. He had done this. Her old, deaf, useless dog had faced down whatever terror had tried to force its way into her home. He had fought for her. Dorothy sank to her knees on the cold floor, the flashlight beam forgotten, rolling away to cast an eerie glow on the wall. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down her face. She reached for him, gently, carefully, her hands smoothing over his matted fur, feeling the tremors that still ran through his body. He whined softly, a low, pained sound, but leaned into her touch. She pulled him gently into her arms, cradling his heavy head, murmuring thanks into his deaf ears, words he couldn't hear but surely felt through the vibration of her chest, through the love pouring from her trembling hands. "Oh, Bud, my brave boy," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, with a terror that was slowly giving way to an impossible, overwhelming pride. "You saved me. You saved me." He closed his eyes for a moment, a deep sigh escaping him, and then, with a quiet, almost imperceptible effort, he shifted, nestling his head closer to her, and lay down, right at her feet, exactly as he always had. Exhausted, bleeding but resolute, he was her guardian, her silent hero. The first slivers of morning light, thin and hesitant, crept over the Tennessee hills, bringing a pale, cold clarity to Dorothy's farmhouse. The air inside was still sharp with the chill that had snaked through the shattered back door, mingling with the faint, metallic scent that lingered from the night's terror. Dorothy sat on the worn couch, wrapped in a thick quilt, a mug of lukewarm coffee clutched in her trembling hands. Bud, bandaged around his flank and with a neat patch covering the gash above his eye, lay curled at her feet, his breathing shallow but steady. He looked small, vulnerable, but intensely alive. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, usually a welcome sound, made Dorothy flinch. Moments later, Harold Henderson's old pickup pulled up, followed closely by a sheriff's deputy's cruiser. Harold and Carol Henderson, his wife, stepped out, their faces etched with concern. The deputy, who had been alerted by a faint alarm signal triggered by the broken door, had called them on his way over. As they walked towards the house, their eyes fell on the mangled back door. Harold stopped dead, his jaw slack. The splintered wood, the door hanging by a single hinge, was undeniable proof of a violent struggle. "Mama!" Harold called out, his voice a strained whisper as he hurried inside. Carol followed, her hand rising to her mouth in a silent gasp. The living room, usually so neat, felt invaded, violated. Dorothy rose, her face pale, her eyes tired, but holding a fierce, protective light as she looked down at Bud. "They tried to get in, Harold," Dorothy said, her voice wavering but gaining strength with each word. "Two of them. They were trying to break down the door." She recounted the harrowing night, her words tumbling out, laced with lingering fear and a dawning, immense pride. She described the crashes, the sounds she couldn't interpret fully. And then, finding Bud. He fought them, Harold. He threw himself against the door. He bit them. He wouldn't let them in. Harold knelt, inspecting the damage, his fingers tracing the fresh gouges in the doorframe, the faint bloodstains on the porch floor where the intruders had stumbled back. He looked from the shattered door to his mother, then finally his gaze settled on Bud. The old dog lay quietly, his bandaged body a testament to the night's battle. His eyes, though weary, were still watchful, fixed on Dorothy. Harold saw the fresh blood on Bud's muzzle, carefully cleaned but still visible, and the raw tenderness with which Dorothy smoothed her hand over his bandaged side. Carol, who had dismissed Bud so easily, saw the depth of his courage, the loyalty that had defied age and disability. Her face, usually quick to offer a practical, often critical opinion, was now completely still. She remembered her own words. "He can't even warn you about a rabbit, let alone anything serious." The irony, the chilling contrast between her casual dismissal and this stark reality hung heavy in the air. Harold slowly rose from his crouch. He looked at the dog he had called undignified, useless, the dog he had wanted to put down because of his age and deafness. He saw the gaping hole in the door, the shattered wood, and understood with a profound, sickening clarity what Bud had prevented. He saw not a confused, stumbling old animal, but a formidable, silent guardian. His words from weeks ago, "He's just suffering, Mama, and it's just kinder to let him go peacefully," now echoed in his mind, hollow and shameful. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with a respect and awe he had never thought to feel for the old, deaf Australian shepherd named Bud. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm his past words had created, but no sounds came. He just stood there, looking at Bud, his eyes filled with a dawning, unspoken apology. The days that followed were a blur of quiet care and gentle recovery in Dorothy's farmhouse. Bud, despite his wounds, showed a remarkable resilience. Dorothy became his constant nurse, carefully changing bandages, coaxing him to eat, and making sure he had the warmest spot by the wood stove. His limp slowly improved. The gash above his eye healed into a faint line, and the raw places on his flank began to scab over. He was still slower, still deaf, but the spark in his intelligent eyes remained undimmed, a quiet testament to his fighting spirit. Harold and Carol visited often, their initial concern for Dorothy quickly shifting to a quiet, almost reverent attention to Bud. Harold especially found himself drawn to the old dog. He'd sit on the porch swing, watching Bud try to track a squirrel with his eyes, a flicker of his old herding instinct still alive. Harold saw how Bud still sought Dorothy's presence, how he would nudge her hand for a scratch, his tail giving a soft, grateful thump. The practical arguments he and Carol had made for euthanasia now felt distant, cold, and utterly irrelevant in the face of Bud's quiet heroism. Carol, too, found herself approaching Bud with a new tenderness. She'd bring him special treats, speaking to him in a soft voice, even though she knew he couldn't hear. She'd watch him follow Dorothy, slow and deliberate, a silent, unwavering shadow. The image of the broken door and the knowledge of what Bud had stood against had etched itself deeply into her conscience. She saw not an expense, but a priceless protector. Weeks turned into a quiet routine of healing and reflection. One late afternoon, the air crisp and hinting at early winter, Dorothy walked back from her small vegetable patch, a basket of late greens in her arm. As she approached the farmhouse, she paused. Through the kitchen window, she saw Harold. He was sitting on the floor by the wood stove, his back against the warm brick, his legs stretched out. And beside him, his head resting gently on Harold's outstretched arm, was Bud. Harold wasn't doing anything in particular, just sitting there quietly stroking Bud's head. Bud, for his part, was utterly content, his eyes closed, occasionally letting out a soft, contented sigh. The old dog, once dismissed as useless, now rested peacefully beside the man who had advocated for his end. There was no conversation, no grand gestures, just the quiet warmth of the fire and the shared presence of man and dog. Dorothy watched them for a long moment, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She thought back to all the arguments, all the practical reasons, all the talk of burdens and expenses. She thought about the night Bud had stood between her and danger, a silent, fierce warrior. He hadn't done it for reward, or for praise, or because he was told. He had done it out of love, out of a bond forged in quiet companionship. She pushed open the back door, its new wood gleaming faintly. Harold looked up, a faint flush rising on his cheeks, as if caught in a private moment. Bud, roused by the vibration, lifted his head and offered a gentle tail wag towards Dorothy. Dorothy walked over, setting her basket down. She looked at Harold, then down at Bud, her eyes soft with understanding. "You know, Harold," she said quietly, her voice warm like good tea. "Sometimes, the ones we think are the most useless, the ones we're ready to write off, they're the ones who show us what real worth truly means." He might not have heard a thing that night, but he felt everything. He felt he belonged. Harold simply nodded, his hand still stroking Bud's head. He didn't say a word, but his eyes, when they met his mother's, spoke volumes. They were filled with a profound respect, a quiet regret, and a dawning, deep appreciation for the old deaf Australian shepherd named Bud. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.